me? Is this okay? So, I was asked to speak today. I've been talking about racism in the church for a few years now, kind of basically since my time in Ferguson. So I did a whole thing last year at the National Youth Gathering. I should have listened to it because now I don't even really remember everything that I talked about. But I'll start this way. I'm a lifelong Lutheran. My dad is black. He's from College Hill, which is just east of here in St. Louis. My mom is white, like half German white, from a town called St. James, Missouri, which is west of here, which is really rural. And they met in the 70s at, does anybody know the, can you still hear me? Does anybody know there's a high school called St. Paul's in Concordia, Missouri. It's a boarding school. Right. So that's where my parents met when it was a junior college. I don't like to totally tell their story because it's their story, but it helps understand a little bit about me if you understand their story. Long story short, my dad got my mom pregnant while they were in college, and with my dad being black and my mom being white at a Lutheran school in the 70s, it didn't go very well. They were kicked out of college, and for a period of time, my mom was disowned by her family. They were much harsher about my dad being black than my dad's family was about my mom being white. That's not an indictment at all. It's just a reality of the scenario. And so my parents joined the military, which is where I spent a majority of my life. I was a military brat. My dad retired when I was 11. We moved to Ferguson, which is where I grew up for almost the rest of my life. I graduated from Lutheran North. Anybody? That's what I'm talking about, back in 2002. And then life started to begin to happen, and I decided to pursue ministry back in 2009. And I went to Concordia, Chicago. I did 1 year at the DCE program, and not overly surprising, but in the DCE program, I was the only black guy. And in all of Concordia, Chicago, there was one other black guy. His name is Gerard Bowling. He's a pastor at Bethlehem in the city, and his sister Janine, who was a deaconess in New York, and we were the 3 black students in the church work program. And then I came to the seminary, and I was the only black guy again in my incoming class. My second year was special. There were 7 black people at the seminary all at one time, different classes. But I began to get interested in the church's history of race relationships between white and black people. And now my interest in that has gone beyond just white and black. But so I started doing research. I just wanted to see, because I always heard people say, like, during slavery, Walther, while he couldn't condemn slavery because the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, he thought the abuses of slavery in America were bad. And I thought if that was a starting point for the church, that at least we can say that the way slaves were treated in America was bad. Maybe we were better moving forward. Now, what I found was both good and bad at different times in history. And so when I began to do this for the National Youth Gathering, I like to start in Scripture. And what does the Bible have to say about different people coming together in the church? I'm not talking about on a societal level. I'm not so convinced that the church can fix society, not just America, but the world, and I'm not quite sure it's our job. It's our job to worship God and be as good a neighbors as we can, and that affects change around us, but not on a global level. Nonetheless, I went in Scripture, and the book of Galatians is really about racism at its heart. It's hard to think about because I think in America, when we talk about racism, your mind, at least my mind, almost immediately defaults to white and black people. I think it's, again, beginning to change a little more flagrantly in America between Mexicans and Asians as well. But nonetheless, the default in America is almost white and black, in my mind, exclusively. Maybe it's because I'm white and black. But nonetheless, but there's another little snippet. And there was always a conflict between like the Hebrew Jews and the Gentile Christians when the church first got together. And of course, the first Christians were Jewish. So when the church first began, they had all of the seats of power and authority in the church. And no matter how good we are at being a Christian, power and authority corrupt the best of us, and it get the best of us in every scenario. And so in Acts chapter 6, it's just this tiny little blip, because it's not really about that, but it's also about that. And what happened was, as the church in the early days, they sold everything that they had for a common collection to distribute equally, so that everybody was taken care of in the church. In particular, widows, fatherless, and the people in prison, because those people can't take care of themselves. Especially in biblical times, if you became a widow, you were kind of out of luck. That's why it's so amazing that the widow gave her last 2 pennies to the box when Jesus was with his disciples. And if you look at the Greek, it says that she actually gives her life when she gives those 2 pennies, because she'll never be able to recuperate that money. Well, I guess a denarii is a little more than a penny, but you get what I'm saying. And so in Acts chapter 6, the Gentiles, the Greeks, go to the apostles, and they're complaining, and they're saying, in the distribution, in this common welfare thing where people are taken care of, their widowed and fatherless weren't being taken care of the Hebrew people. And then the apostles quickly reconciled it. They said, appoint for elders for yourselves to make sure your people are taken care of. Now, I love that part of scripture, because they didn't have to dwell upon the racism. They didn't think about it. It wasn't like, oh, well, just try a little bit harder. Maybe you guys should take your own collection, and maybe you'll be able to take care of yourselves. It was a quick fix. They appointed their own elders, and their people were taken care of. And I think when it comes to us, the church, taking care of each other, whether we're white, black, Chinese, Hispanic, or whatever, that's the model we're meant to follow. So you follow history. I don't know. It's probably messy. I didn't study everything, because I just wanted to get to the time of the church, because I did a paper when I was in seminary, and I was just curious about this. And back in the early 20th century, there used to be a black seminary in Greensboro, North Carolina, for Lutheran pastors to go and be trained. And that was a very good thing, to be able for the church to recognize the need for African American leaders and provide them a place. But here's where the church began to hiccup, right? There's a pastor by the name of Andrew Schultze. He was around, again, like the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and he was a pastor of a black church in St. Louis. And he had young men from his church that wanted to become pastors. He has a lot more to talk about racism in the church than just this, but I don't want to shock you just yet. But nonetheless, he had 2 young men from his church that wanted to become pastors, I believe in the early 50s. And because they were from St. Louis, they wanted to go to the St. Louis Seminary. And this is where the church has let us down historically. Because at the time, America was still operating on a separate but equal basis. If you're not aware, St. Louis used to be legally segregated until the late 60s, early 70s. Late 60s, early 70s. My dad was born in 1954, so we're really talking about one generation from me. I'll be 36 next month, so I'm not very old. So back in the 60s, my dad still remembers white honey fountains, places that he couldn't go. When I was at Lutheran North, we did our senior prom at the Missouri Athletic Club. And my dad was super excited about it. And the Missouri Athletic Club is actually a really nice place, but when you're 17, who cares where it is? It's just about partying with your friends, right? And so I was so confused why he was so excited. And he told me before I left to go to prom, it's because when he was a kid, he wasn't allowed to go. It's a place that he was excluded from. And so this attitude in St. Louis isn't new. And so when these young men wanted to go to seminary, they considered it. But after considering it, they said, well, we have this seminary exclusively for black students, so they can't come here, they have to go there. And because they made that decision, at that point in time, those 2 young men decided not to become pastors in the church. And so imagine if back in the 50s, if it had been possible for that to begin to happen, and we had a different generation of black pastors in our church being raised up back then, what could the church look like today? Because the LCMS is the 3rd least diverse religious body in all of America. There are two churches that are less diverse than us. It's the Southern Baptist and, ironically, the ELCA. And then us. And then everybody else is more diverse. Some not radically more diverse, some a little way more diverse, but we're 96% white. And again, don't take it the wrong way, my mom is white, so I don't hate white people. But America's not 96% white. St. Louis certainly isn't 96% white, but if you go around our congregations, you're going to find a majority of white people. Even the church that I grew up in, Chapel of the Cross, the neighborhood they're in is almost exclusively black. And the church is still probably 90% white, if not a touch on the other side of 90. And the reason why it matters so much to me, so my first real encounter with racism happened when I was 6 years old. My dad, we were living on the military base in Beaufort, South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is its own place, but military bases are quite unique. If you've never lived on one, it's hard to explain it to you. But picture America the right way. I don't know. That's about the best way I can explain it. Where patriotism is a real thing. It's not polarizing. I grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance proudly with my hand over my heart. When revelry happened in the morning, we all stopped. If a basketball was being shot, we would stop immediately, turn towards the base flag, and pause. When taps happened in the evening, we would do the same exact thing. People cringe when I say this, at least in the black community, but I'll still share it with you. That song, Proud to Be an American, well, when I was in elementary school, in particular, first grade, that's when the first Desert Storm was going on, and it happened overnight. All of our dads were basically gone from the base overnight, and we were planning an assembly when our dads were going to come back, and we were going to sing that song to them. So that's the kind of upbringing I had. Being an American was something that was really indoctrinated into my soul. But when I was 6, we got a new neighbor on our street, a next door neighbor, and he really didn't like us very much. And I didn't understand when I was 6 at first, but he put this fence on the dividing line between our yard, and not a fence like that. This is like a low garden fence, just so that me and my brothers and sisters knew where his yard began and where ours ended. And he told us when he was installing it not to cross that line. Well, there were woods behind my backyard, and then there was a corner here to a field that went to like the baseball fields and soccer fields. And so at the very corner where our yards connected in the back, you had to cross his yard to get to the field. There was a common space, and there was a lone tree in the middle of this field, and we had built a ladder going into the tree with a little tree house, as good as you can do when you're 6 and 7 years old. And I just wanted to go hang out in the tree, so I ran, and I probably crossed a little bit too much of his yard, and I'm climbing up the tree, and I get about 5 steps high, and I feel something yank me out of the tree, and it's this grown man, a Marine, my neighbor, and he's calling me the N-word as he's pushing me down back into my yard, telling me not to go back into his yard. And that was my first experience, and it was very scarring. He was drunk. Every time I tell this story without fail, I can still smell the whiskey on his breath. But that was out of place. It was so unusual. I'm not going to say there are no racists in the military. Of course there are, but that behavior is completely unacceptable. To the point where I have a cousin named Billy. My mom's cousin grew out in the middle of Missouri. Billy, when he was about like 16 or 17, joined the KKK. He already has his tombstone. I always think this is so wild about Billy, but him and his wife already have their plots. They're still alive. And on the back of his plot is a Confederate flag. But Billy is not a racist anymore. Billy went to the Marine Corps. And by serving next to people of color, Billy's life was radically changed to the point whenever we do visit our family now, when Billy comes in the house, he'll ignore everybody else until he speaks to my dad first. First, because my dad is his brother in the Marine Corps, but also just because just loves my dad so much, and I think it's his way of kind of repenting for his evil as a young man. And I'm telling you this story because if the Marine Corps can change somebody's heart when it comes to racism, shouldn't the church be able to change the hearts of people who come into it? And I could tell you multiple stories, but I'll stick to the recent stories. And so, long story short, the seminary is now integrated. It doesn't matter what color you are. You can train to be a pastor at St. Louis Seminary, but it's still such a hard topic to talk about in our church. And when I got my call to Ferguson, this is when I quickly realized that our church at Broad just needs cultural education, that we simply just don't know people who are different than us, and we don't know much about them, and because we don't know who they are, we don't know what they're about, we're afraid of them. And the funny thing is, if you go into a black neighborhood and you talk about white people, it might be anger, but that anger is born of fear, because they simply don't know any white people, and they haven't had any white people change their heart either. And so I had to do my own funding when I was in Ferguson, so I traveled all around the country talking about Ferguson. I quickly had to help people understand first the context of St. Louis. An exit down 170, you get to Delmar. There's a very well-known, documented, ongoing study called the Delmar Divide. Delmar, especially in the Loop, is one of the most segregated streets in all of the world, from north to south. And you don't have to go block to block. It's literally across the street. On the south side of Delmar, the community is 75% white. On the north side of Delmar, it's 90% black. I think the average, I haven't been doing Ferguson for a while, but I think the average household income on the south side of Delmar is around $70,000-ish, $75,000-ish. On the north side, it's $18,000. And just continue to create that divide. So that's just a block away. Again, St. Louis was legally segregated not that long ago. And so I was trying to have to tell people, because they wanted to know how Ferguson could explode the way it did so quickly. And well, now it's no longer Ferguson, it's everywhere. But nonetheless, I used to go around and talk about this, and I was at a church in a state in this country. I won't be specific just because there's no real point. It was south. And I was doing my presentation on Ferguson, and there was a guy sitting in the front row. He was white, and it felt like every word I said, his face got redder. And he was getting angrier and angrier, and I like people to ask questions because that's how we learn. And so I always leave space at the end of my presentations for people to ask questions, and I knew he was going to be one of the first. So I just began to brace myself, and I said, "Are there any questions?" His hand shot up in the air, and I said, "Okay." And his first words verbatim were, "No disrespect to you and your color, but..." And I'm not quite sure everything he had to say after that. It was about welfare and things like that. He was basically saying that black people are no good for nothings. They just like to benefit from the government, not work, and that we're lazy. Which is hurtful because I'm a person of color, and I like to at least pretend that I work very hard at my job, at being a dad, at being a good citizen. But the ironic part is that when Ferguson began to happen and they began to survey the community, and they were asking questions, what's the number one need? The resounding number one need in North St. Louis was jobs. People didn't have jobs, and because of, and I had to work with this, some people have criminal records, they can't get jobs, even for non-violent things. You go to a company and you try to, be an advocate for somebody and for something they did 25 years ago, and they're still unemployed because of something they did again when they were kids. I hope I don't get judged on what I did when I was 16, 17, 18 years old. Well, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, even till, well, not today, but you get what I'm saying. And it was heartbreaking that somebody in the church that's their attitude as I'm doing this thing. And when I came home, I told people that should have been at least able to raise some awareness about this, and nothing happened. There was a sorry this happened to you, and that was the end of the discussion. Nobody in my circle of people that I was working with wanted to talk about it further. Fast forward, I was in a church around here. It wasn't Immanuel, I'll say that. And I was doing my presentation for a group of people, and again, asking questions, and somebody came up and they wanted to talk to me. And I was like, oh, just ask, because it's good for everybody to hear these questions, because sometimes you have a question that people are afraid to ask, especially when it comes to this. And he's like, oh, no, but I don't like that. And so I was like, well, why don't we go out into the hallway and you can just tell me one-on-one. And all he wanted to tell me was that the events of Ferguson made him more of a racist. Now, this is the disheartening part about that one. He probably had been holding that in and probably has never told a single black person until me, but he knows that I'm a pastor in the LCMS, so at least the odds of getting punched in the face are a little bit less. I can't say it didn't cross my mind. Forgive me, Lord. But that's the current scenario. Now, I will say this, that most of the bigoted people that I come across in the church are older. They grew up in a St. Louis that was segregated, and they were taught from a very young age to hate black people, and that hate has probably spread onto anybody who's non-white. But here's the challenge for you and me, generationally speaking, is first and foremost, racism isn't new or exclusive to America. We already see that the first Christians had to deal with this in the church. Racism isn't genetic. You're not born being a racist. There's no marker that's going to predispose you to being racist. It's an ideology that gets taught and passed down from generation to generation. And as we look out into the world, how is our society doing with racism today? Not great. I feel like every day there's a new video clip of somebody going on some ignorant tirade of any color. It's not exclusive to white people. By any means, bigotry knows no color, knows no nationality. But how about in the church? I did something like this in 2019, a full year ago now. Actually, maybe to the day, or pretty close to the day. And then my speech from the National Youth Gathering in 2019 got brought back to life after George Floyd. And the exact same thing I said in 2019 applies the exact same way it does today, is that as a church body, we're really still struggling with this. And I have theories, but the problem is if you don't want to deal with racism, you're white. It really doesn't affect you all that much in America. And again, there's nothing wrong with being white. That's not an indictment towards you. That's just a reality. My children, especially my oldest, is very pale. My wife is white, and my oldest son is blonde-haired with green eyes. He's a perfect genetic experiment between two people. And if you never saw him with me, you would never in a million years dream that he came from a family of black people. And so he could very well deny it. Now, I don't think he will. At least he loves me for now, right? What I'm getting at is that my wife is also white, and she didn't really get it until we got married and moved back to St. Louis. And people would double take at us at the mall, both white and black. I can be blatantly honest with you. There are some black women that don't like my wife because she's married to me and I'm a successful black person. And they might think that she robbed one of the successful ones away from our community. It doesn't work that way, but they can certainly feel that way if they want to. And so as we continue to exist in the church, it's going to be very difficult for us to maneuver. People always ask, what do we do today? Today is repent and pray and try to be a better neighbor tomorrow. Because it's not like in 2021, we're going to be like 50-50 or 60-40 or even 95-5. It's something that takes time. But I'll say the same thing I said to the youth at the National Youth Gathering to you, is that I get inspired by your generation when it comes to these issues. Your activity in the world and your courage and your braveness on tough issues, at least from where I'm standing, seems unwavering. And so when it comes to this, and again, I hate to say it like this, but black people are no longer alone when it comes to bigotry. I just saw this video of a guy yelling at an Asian family trying to eat their dinner at a restaurant with their kids, cursing them out, telling them to go back from where they came. But their English was so American that I'm willing to guess that they're at least second generation. So they probably are back from where they came. And so it's just something that we have to continue. And if the church isn't going to be active in this, if we're not going to demonstrate this, not out of obligation, but because God has created all people, He's created this wonderful, diverse world that we don't have to ignore. Don't be colorblind, because diversity is what God created and it's the way He wants it to be. It should, in fact, be something that we celebrate and that we magnify, that from two people came all of these different nations in the world. That's wonderful. But if we're not leading in love, then how can we expect anything to change in our neighborhood, let alone the church? And so that's my thing. I don't know so much about the world, but I do know that the church can be diverse, first and foremost because at Pentecost, that's what happened. Tribes from different nations, different peoples, they looked different, they spoke different languages, came and confessed Jesus as Lord and were baptized. And when God talks about heaven in the future, in the book of Revelation, that eternity will be spent with people from every tribe and every nation. Heaven's going to be diverse. Imagine that. And so as we work and we try and we struggle, we succeed and we fail, we should just keep that image of the church in mind as truly a place for all people to come and be welcomed and to be loved by God. Exclusively that way, in God's love. So I'm going to stop now. And if there are any questions, feel free. I think there's a group chat.
Yeah, so a few of you are on our group meet, so you're welcome to say a question, or you're welcome to text me privately or as a group if you'd rather state your question. Make sense?
Or can they ask individually?
Yes, please do ask individually too.
Don't feel like you have to ask questions either. I know Esther wants you to, but you also don't have to. It's not a requirement. Going once? Cool. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate you listening, for being kind and... Oh, all right, almost.
So, I guess going back to what can the church do?
Mm-hmm.
What is the church doing in Ferguson?
That's in Ferguson. In Ferguson, I can't speak to because it's hard, because when you leave a call, you should leave. And I was kind of like the first in Ferguson, and the people there. If I went over there, people would look to me instead of the people who are still doing ministry because of familiarity. So out of fairness, I stay away. But the church at large, and so again, it's interesting because after Ferguson, not much. And of course, after Ferguson, there have been loads of other things. I mean, there was Minnesota, there was Baltimore, there was Milwaukee. It feels like this has been going on for a very long time. But after George Floyd, people were in the church saying there's a campaign called It's Time on it's interesting, they use the hashtag on Facebook, but I wonder if they have an Instagram as well. But there's a new organization called it's like Lutherans for Life, but it's like Lutherans for
Racial Justice.
Is it Lutherans for Racial Injustice?
Yeah.
And they have a petition that you can sign online, which is basically just saying that when it comes to racial division in our country, we're not going to stay silent as a church anymore. We're going to begin to be active. And that it takes time to grow, because as it gets attention, it'll go before our convention where our Lutheran laws are made. And in about every convention, which happens every 3 years, there's something like affirming that all people are created in God's image and loved by God. But what does that mean exactly? And so there's a move to, well, before George Floyd, me being hired at the seminary, if you're unfamiliar, there aren't a lot of people of color that work at the seminary. Well, rewind. There are lots of people who work at the seminary who are people of color. There aren't a lot of called people, church work people who work at the seminary that are people of color. There's me, Leo Sanchez, a professor, Dr. John Loom, and Mark. His last name starts with a K. He's like one of those German Brazilians. It's not Krieger. But anyway, just a handful, not very many. And so the seminary is working very close with the Black Clergy Caucus of the LCMS. There are some black pastors in the LCMS. Most of them are older, and they came out of Selma. A lot of them were taught in Rosa Young schools. If you don't know who Rosa Young is, you can look that up. Under 40, maybe 7 of us, maybe 8. I might be overestimating, but I can't do it by myself. I can't go out and find a new generation of people of color, but we're really putting a lot of effort into being more welcoming and more open to raising a different generation of pastors that look different, because birds of a feather, there's a reason why that's cliche, because it's just true still. Maybe that'll change one day. So that's one thing. Lutherans for Racial Injustice, once this gets before Synod, they're putting a lot of things done together. I should follow it more closely, but you know, I got my own thing that I got to be focusing on. But so there used to be a Black Concordia in Selma, Alabama. It's now closed. And so we're trying to figure out, well, if that's where Black Lutherans used to come from, now where are they going to come from? And so we're trying to discern that. Whether it's an Institute of Black Lutheran Studies, that's one thing that's on the docket now. But there's a lot of different things that are at least in conversation. But going from conversation to action, we are a bureaucratic church, and bureaucracy turns its wheel slow, but we're trying to at least get them to turn a little bit faster. So some things are being done. We'll just see how fruitful they are. That's a good question. Put me on the spot. Thank you.
All right, I have another one from
Okay.
La Telephone. And anyone can answer to this, but what ideas do you have so that we can continue to grow together instead of apart, especially, like, particularly at Immanuel, especially with Light of Christ versus white people versus black people? How can we, like, here and now come together?
Well, definitely. So coming to Immanuel, that was one of the most incredible things that I found out, that there was a Chinese church. And so you guys are blessed that you actually are really a church together, and you share a building and space. So you should do this more, so that at least you all get to know each other more and get to learn each other's cultures. My wife and I, and you should do it because it's actually a wonderful experience. Every month Dorothy goes, and when I'm in town and she goes on the Sunday, we go to Light of Christ. And I'll be honest with you, it's in Chinese, so we don't.
Is it English and Chinese?
Is it both?
Yes.
Well, there we go.
No excuse.
See? Well, and it's a wonderful experience because they're the ones leading it. And then, even better, you guys always have a potluck after church. Is that every time?
After church.
Yeah.
After church. But not now.
Not now, of course.
Yeah.
Before COVID. So when this is all over,
Yeah, we just cannot wait for the COVID to be done.
when this is over, if you go to Light of Christ, it's all homemade Chinese food. Spoil yourself. That's how you begin. And once you guys get to know each other better, down Olive, there's All Nations, another Lutheran church that is fairly diverse. They have more black people than most Lutheran churches, and they have young people. Get to know their young people. Just reach out to other, I would say just reach out to other churches going east from here, because Bethlehem's the same way. They have a youth group. Go to Bethlehem, spend time with them, see how they do things, what they do. Ask them about their lives. North St. Louis is pretty rough. And a lot of those kids live pretty hard lives, and Bethlehem is their one place of respite. And it's not uncommon. Even South St. Louis, I did an after school program at Messiah in the City, and we were getting to know these fifth graders. They're 10 years old, and sixth graders 11. And one of the kids was talking about the story of when his dad got shot in their kitchen in front of him, and he watched him die. And he was 10, and he was just telling it like it was a normal story. And if you can talk about your dad being shot and killed like a normal story, your life is rough. And just hear their experience. I think that empathy comes from proximity. And so if we're going to keep people who are different than us at arm's length because that feels safe, we'll never get close to anybody. We got to get uncomfortable, and it can't always be them coming to our space. That's a common problem the church has. They say, I want to reach out to the community, so then we do something on our church property. Well, that's inviting, but it's them coming here where we're comfortable. We have to go where they're comfortable in order for them to open up to us.
Great ideas.
Can I say something? I think, the issue of racism, you are going to face it for the rest of your life, basically, because this has been there since the biblical times. All right, in the Old Testament, you read about it, there is, and for me personally, I have faced it, but when my family, we were doing mission work as missionaries in Australia, we were living in Melbourne, Australia. Only 1 week when we were there, I was walking home after a bus ride from my office, from my church office, and I'm walking towards my house. Suddenly there was a car that stopped right in front of me, and two kids came out of their car and flipped the middle finger at us and called me to go home to my country. That was my welcoming to Australia at 1 week after we arrived there. So I never forget that. This kind of things, I think for others you may meet it, and any race or any place that you all grow and you all grow up, you all will be traveling quite a bit. You'll be going to China, Africa, or you will be a minority there, and people will look at you differently. And there are certain kind of expression, they will look down and look at you in a very different light. So don't be taken aback. And I think one of the things as Christians, we have a wonderful thing, because we as Christians, we have a special gift from God. We experience the love of God because God loves us, and we can love others. And 1 Corinthians 13 talks about love. Love is the greatest things of all. When my family came to America, 6 of us with several suitcases, we have nothing, we have no home, and it was the church that accepted us, the church that embraced us, the Lutheran church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, embraced us wholly and helped us to move into our apartments, the church people provided us all the furniture that we need, the television in those days, black and white TVs. You know, and we had all those things all because of the church people with their good hearts reaching out to us. And that really warms us and overwhelms us. And the same thing, I think we can break the barriers with love of God. God gives us that ability to love others. Even though they may be different, they speak differently from you, or they act differently, but because of Christ's love that we experience, we can accept somebody else who is different from us. So let us, you know, and I love this. This is something that I'm dream for, that we all can integrate together. I love, you know, I told our young people in our Light of Christ side, I said, you're going to be growing up working with our fellow brothers and sisters, or you know, with other people. In this culture, you have to get used to it. And I wish that I can get my parents from Light of Christ to join that group. That will be my next task. We're going to start a parents group after you guys have this group together. All right, thank you.
I like it. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate you.